Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Welcome to VUX World, the Voice User Experience and Strategy podcast. I might sound a little bit hasty. I've got a little bit of a cold, but I'm hoping we can battle through. I'm feeling fine, but my voice is a little bit croaky. Feeling a little bit like Phoebe from Friends when she had that cold and her voice was really kind of husky and cool. So I don't know if this is going to be better or worse. I don't know. You could decide. But anyway, moving on with the show today. We have a very special show lined up for you. We're going to be talking all about VUI design and VUI tuning, which is a new concept for me. This is going to be extremely interesting. We have somebody who is vastly experienced in the VUI world, working in the IVR space. She is Simone Wilson from Pindrop, and we're going to be talking all about Pindrop, all about voice security, all about VUI design, all about VUI tuning, the differences and similarities between IVR and the kind of voice space right now, and a whole lot more as well. This is going to be an immense episode, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. This is VUX World.
It's actually pronounced Simone.
Simone, right. Fantastic. I'll edit that one out, then I'll go back and change that up.
That's fine. I just wanted to do it like 10 times so you'd have to edit it every time.
Yeah. Cool. Hello there, Simone. Apologies, I got your name wrong. Hopefully I have re-recorded it, so when it plays back I won't look so foolish, but I'll probably not do myself any favours by admitting I got your name wrong in the first place. So apologies anyway, but Simone Wilson, hello and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It is a pleasure. It is an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for joining us all the way from Atlanta. So, Simone, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and your career to date? You've been doing the VUI thing for most of your career. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your kind of career path and how you've got to where you are now?
Sure. I actually started pretty technical with my undergrad degree in mathematics and computer science, and I did C++ coding for a few years in the aerospace industry out in DC before I sort of started gravitating to user interfaces. And at the time, they were graphical user interfaces, mostly using X Windows and building interfaces that way. And then being in the DC area, there was a program at the Georgetown University called Computational Linguistics. And one of my hobbies or interests had always been linguistics and language exploration. And at the time, my company would pay for you to go to school and anything that was remotely related to what you did on the job. And so I more or less got my master's degree there in computational linguistics just because it interested me and it was more or less free. So that worked out. I stayed at Hughes for a couple of years while I was getting my degree, and I actually did some time at Malibu Research Labs in California because that's the remotely related part of my program where they were actually doing research in talking to your cars, hearing the directions read back to you. And this was back, so it was in its infancy, any kind of voice devices. And that was interesting to me, but I wasn't maybe so much cut out for research, which is what they did out there. I've always been more of a person who wants to build something and get it into callers or users' hands and get that feedback, and so I can iterate and know I'm making an impact for the callers. So I moved into VUI design as my focus, sort of broad spectrum of information retrieval, search engines, and machine learning and natural language understanding and all kinds of things, acoustic. But at the same time, there were some tools starting to be built. The early one I used was at the Oregon Graduate Institute, and it was an IVR design call flow sort of system. And I was really interested in that. It was very easy to use. And again, interact with the callers right away. You could build a quick demo system and call a number and interact, just on whatever the subject was at the time. So really from before I even finished my degree, I started building in tools like that. And I stayed with what's called VUI design or voice user interface design for what I guess ends up being decades. But so I did a lot of IVR design work with various companies. I did startups and I worked at Microsoft, and I've worked for other big companies, small companies. I've contracted and worked on my own for years. But I quickly turned into doing tuning, as you mentioned. So for me, designing is necessary and interesting, and I like doing sort of usability studies and getting things designed. But in a lot of places, you end up just designing forever and you get really attached to the design. And when you hand it to customers, it can become really static and you ignore their actual responses. And I really like the iterative aspect where once you've designed and deployed, you can actually collect the data and hear back from callers and then make adjustments. And I can go into more detail on that, but that's where I sort of really found my interest. Like, whether I designed it or not, I like evaluating the systems, making the recommendations and helping to implement the changes. And just recently, last year, like you said, I'm at Pindrop. I've been able to move into something that I think is even more helpful for callers, is not just design and tune systems, but actually make them fraud-free and improve authentication rates. And not only can I help design your IVR and suggest recommended changes for how to use Pindrop's fraud and authentication products, but I can actually protect you as well as making it easier. So that's been fun for me because over the years, as most people know, IVRs haven't been terribly popular, but speech has become popular again with all of the IoT devices and Alexa. People are interested in spending the money on the right technology. And now people get excited when I talk to them about protecting fraud and improving their speech areas. So that's been a fun change for me in recent years as well.
Cool. It seems to be, IVR seems to be having a, well, I was going to say a renaissance. It's obviously a hugely widely used technology that's in the vast majority of call centers. So it's been around for a long, long time. And maybe it's just because I haven't come across it in terms of this side of it, but it does seem to be having almost like a resurgence. Would you say that's true? Like,
I agree, and that's part of the exciting side for me, because like I said, when people would ask what I did before, and I would say, well, when you call your bank and you hear a computer instead of a person, and then you start to see their eyes roll in the back of their head, they want to tell you how they hate it. And before they would start speaking, I would bust in and say, I make those better, because I was on the tuning side, and that's how I saw my role was. I don't just design them and leave them out there and let you suffer. I record the calls, analyze them, transcribe them, figure out what's going wrong, and know for sure that I'm having an impact on improving certain areas so that you call back in. Because I think, like I said, the technology has become so easy to use, and people are starting to expect it everywhere. IVR is pretty much ubiquitous. We've had natural language understanding of a high level for decades now, like you see in Alexa and so on. As it's so popular and sort of expected by callers, companies are finally wanting to invest in it. And so now I can build systems on top of it using that and make everybody's lives easier.
So you're talking about, you mentioned on the security side and fraud prevention side, and your most recent role and current role at Pindrop. Do you want to tell those listeners out there what Pindrop is and what Pindrop does?
Sure. So Pindrop's been around for about half a dozen years and launched with an initial product that was just about fraud, detecting fraud, mostly in call centers, in real time, and being able to protect customers and the companies from fraud. So if fraud is maybe 2% of your total callers, let's hope, we were and really focusing on fraudsters. With my hiring last year coincided with the new product launch at Pindrop, which is called Passport, and that is aimed at authentication. So it's really supposed to, in addition to a layering on top of the fraud protection, it's looking at the other 90%, 98% of your callers, and making better, because not only do we know you're not fraud, we can now treat you better. And so your call is protected, but knowing that, why don't we improve your experience? And so not ask you as many questions up front, or give you access to higher risk transactions right on a phone call. And that's whether you're in the IVR or talking to an agent. It's an end-to-end system. And that just makes everybody's experience more pleasant. The calls are shorter. Even the agents, as we've found out, are happier because the callers who they end up talking to are happier. And that just makes people call back more often and be happier to talk to the IVRs, which, as we just covered, has not been terribly popular the last couple of decades. So really having that layer of security, in addition being able to improve an experience, just makes the whole system work better.
And it's been getting quite a lot of press, hasn't it, this kind of passport thing? I've seen a couple of articles from the last kind of few months. One of them was on biometricupdate.com, which is interesting, covering the deep voice side of it, which we might be able to chat about in a minute. But the really interesting one was there was one on Forbes, which is all about the passport feature, and there's also a really cool YouTube video, which I'll put the link in the show notes as well. And essentially, it's kind of demonstrating the passport feature on an Echo device, and it's kind of like the example is trading Bitcoin. So the chap Matt Garland, who presumably Matt Garland's at Pindrop. I haven't gone as far as to figure out what his role is at the moment. Yeah, so cool. It would be a bit strange. It would be a bit strange if it was just a random stranger who happens to have hacked into an Alexa and got his hands on Pindrop's product. But yeah, so Matt Garland, he's got this Echo, and he's talking to it, and he's trying to trade Bitcoin. So he kind of finds the price of this kind of like crypto coin, and then he asks Alexa to sell it, and then somebody else comes over and he tries to do the same kind of thing, but it doesn't let him because it's not recognizing his voice. So that's exactly. Is that the sort of like, that's the Pindrop sort of USP, if you like? It's the ability to be able to recognize that people are who they say they are.
Right, exactly. And it's like you said, authentication is getting traction in the field, and with Deep Voice, which we have in-house here in our research group as well at Pindrop. And that particular video really showcases all of those points very succinctly. It's a very short video, and the reason behind that is because it's making transactions so easy, and it really displays the fact that not only is it detecting that you're not a fraudster and allowing you to do the transaction, it's very easy and short, and doesn't have to ask you a lot of questions because you're already authenticated into the system based on your previous calls, right? And then somebody else comes along and tries to make the same transaction, but it knows automatically, yeah, that's the same device. You're saying some of the same words, but your voice doesn't match. And so one of the things that showcases is voice, but Pindrop actually has I think it's around 200 right now factors that go into determining whether you're authenticated versus a fraudster, for instance. And voice is one area. Then, like I said, there's sort of the device. So whether it's your Google Home or your mobile phone, or if you're on expected line, as well as your behavior. And so that might be how you talk, how loud you talk, but on a mobile phone, it might be if you're pressing buttons, kind of the pattern you usually enter a number with, or something along those lines. So there's actually so many factors that go into it, and that particular video does a really good voice.
So what's the difference or the distinction between deep voice and passport?
So Deep Voice is really one component of Passport. So Passport is really the name of our product.
Okay.
But authentication in general is what has the sort of, couple of hundred factors that go into it. And from a product sales perspective, the tools that go along with it, we kind of group them into the three areas: voice print, behavior print, and device print. And one of the biggest parts of the voice print is deep voice. And that's the in-house sort of research that we have. It's just on an Alexa device, there isn't as much of an interaction on any other level. You're not necessarily touching it, and the device isn't as strong as it is with, say, a mobile phone.
Okay, so that and one of the things about that because it was interesting, it was one of the, what was it? I think it was episode 4 of this podcast. We spoke to Jeff Smith, and it was all about conversational AI. And we kind of got into the realms there of like what the next generation of kind of like hacksters or fraudsters or con artists might be. And there was a really interesting, there's a really interesting tool called Lyrebird, and it kind of generates synthetic voices. And one of Jeff's points was saying that, because the tools to generate synthetic voices are so sophisticated these days, if you were just to ring up a call center manually and play a synthetic voice, it's very easy to kind of fool people to believe that this synthetic voice is the real person. But the whole passport thing, that doesn't wash, does it? It can distinguish the difference between synthetic voices and real voices, can it?
That's exactly right. A lot of research has gone into that exact kind of attack. And Lyrebird is one of the things we use for testing. So synthetic voice or recorded voice, there's a big push for fraudsters into concatenating voice. So, for instance, your voice is probably out on the internet all over the place. And so you could actually record little bits of what you've said that's available on YouTube together to say certain things. So if on another product, for instance, you have to actively enroll your voice, and there's a certain have to say, then they could record it, synthesize it, concatenate it, record it to say, that exact phrase. And that's one of our products here at Pindrop, is that it's completely passive authentication. And so there's nothing that you have to do or say specifically in order your profiles so that later on you're authenticated. It's completely passive and it can lead to a frictionless experience going forward. Like you see a pretty frictionless experience in the Bitcoin example. But that's where sort of my consultation comes in, because some customers aren't ready for completely frictionless. My example is always, if you have the front end to an app or something and you're calling in millennials, they're going to be fine with something that's completely frictionless and just be glad it happened so easily. But if you're working with an older group life insurance company, you might want to ease them in and indicate what's happening and saying, okay, I have recognized your voice based on last time when you called, and now I'm going to let you do this high risk transaction. But a lot of callers don't necessarily need that. So in consultation with our customers, I will provide exactly how frictionless they may want to go.
Okay, that sounds really interesting. That and is the Pindrop Passport product and all of this, the kind of authentication side, is that at the moment purely targeted in the IVR space, or has it kind of branched out into other areas? You've kind of mentioned and sort of said Alexa a few times. Is that an area that it's involved in at the moment as well, or an area that it's looking to get into? Where does Pindrop exist at the moment?
Yeah. So
sorry, Passport. Sorry, where does Passport exist?
Yeah. Well, that's kind of the shorthand anyway. Traditionally, we had the one called. And since this we officially launched in January, the second sort of suite of products, which is Passport, and that's the authentication side. So traditionally we were in call centers, and that was the old, what was called Protect, the fraud product. But now being able to layer in the Passport authentication side, we basically have the opportunity to go end-to-end on a call. So you call into an IVR, it's already checking to see if you've spoofed a call or if it's a known and all of those things start happening as soon as you pick up the phone, or actually in the carrier space. And then all the way through to whether you stay in the IVR and press buttons and try to do something or speak there, to even if you go out to an agent for whatever reason, either actively or because you couldn't do what you needed to do, if you go out to the agent, all of that information carries forward, and we continue doing the evaluation when you're on that side of things as well. And so it's a full end-to-end. So it's IVR and call center agent, but then also, as you said, where we've got some examples talking to Alexa, really as far as that's concerned, that anything you can talk to, that's where we'll be. So in our demos and in research, we have already created these proof of concepts for various devices, and really the customers will lead us into that area, right? So if we have somebody we're using iWatch, and our customers are always talking to their iWatch, then that's where the focus of our next version of authentication will be. But it's basically any space where you can speak to it, whether it's your car or your microwave. We can put a layer of security and authentication inside.
Okay, so who's the sort of typical client then for Pindrop? I'm just trying to, one of the things we do on the podcast, I mean, we provide help and guidance for designers and developers, and some of that we'll come into with the VUI design and tuning in a little bit. But we also like to try and help brands out to try and think about where they can, how they can implement a voice first strategy, and where, the environments in which they can kind of play in, if you know what I mean. So what kind of clients would find this kind of technology useful, and what kind of transactions are the more kind of higher risk transactions? I'm presuming it's financial, but there may be other kind of areas. What's the kind of typical client for Pindrop?
Yeah, so initially, obviously, the financial institutions are the most interested, and where we have our first versions, especially with authentication coming out. Anybody who has financial data, but then also anything that's healthcare related, right? Because there's a privacy issue. Your customers are very interested in keeping that information private. So it's not necessarily transaction based at that point. So those are kind of the first two layers. Retail is also a big player because they have your financial data as well. Your if you're a big retail company and you have your own credit cards, for instance, and even gift cards or rewards along those lines. We don't want somebody going in and ordering a bunch of things on your time. But really it does go, so those are the first sort of areas, the obvious places that you go in where they're coming to us and saying, hey, we need this, because as we've all seen in the news lately, there's been all kinds of data breaches, whether it's Target or other big companies. It's something that people are more aware of, and individual users or callers to those companies are worried. And so people are reaching out to us to try and say, okay, this is what we're doing. We're taking a step, and Pindrop is one of those steps. But even just recently, there are new spaces we're moving into. So interested in having their baristas talk to the equipment in the kitchen, if you can believe it. And so there's an issue there about who's authorized to the latte machine, and trying to pick it up in a noisy environment and make sure only the right people are talking to the right machines at the right time. So there's a lot of really creative ideas in that space. And every time somebody brings one in, we entertain it and kind of spitball that with our research and let that help guide us into the direction we're going.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds really interesting. That, I mean, I think that there is certainly as these well, I suppose voice as an interface, as that starts to become more and more prevalent, which it is beginning to. I think I've come across some stats around something like 20% of Americans have got a smart speaker, it's a mental fact that. And as soon as people start getting more comfortable with it, I can see this being, a critical component to taking that voice as an interface through into the kind of space that mobile and the web is in now, in being able to do, those kind of transactions. I think it sounds like a really, really great product, that.
Yeah, I agree.
We'll be right back with Simony Wilson in just a moment, but first I would like to just tell you about this week's flash briefing question. This week's flash briefing question is: are brands failing on Amazon Alexa and Google Home? Are brands failing on Amazon Alexa and Google Home? The reason I asked that question is because I spent some time on Dashbot this week, and if you don't know Dashbot.io, the next episode of the VUX World podcast is featuring Artie Merritt, the CEO of Dashbot. Fantastic company, and they publish regularly trends in terms of skill usage and skill reviews and enablements, downloads and stuff like that. And you can just peruse that website, and it is fantastic reading. It's really, really interesting to see what skills are doing well, what skills aren't doing so well, and what the most common categories are and stuff like that. And I was just having a look around, and in all of the brand skills that I come across, all seem to have pretty poor reviews. Now, I'm going to try testing them out this week, and I'll let you know how that goes. But what I want to know is, from your perspective, the people listening to this podcast, people in the industry, people who are working with brands to create these experiences, what are your thoughts? What are you finding when you're working with brands, and what has been the output and the fruits of some of your labour? You can get involved in the discussion on Twitter at VUX World. We'll be running a poll on this as we do each week. You can get involved there. You can also send us an audio clip or upload a video onto Twitter, and we'll play it on the flash briefing. If you do want to get involved, you can also go to facebook.com/VUX World. You can post on our Facebook page there. Again, preferably audio and video, because that way we can play it on the flash briefing this week. Or you can go to vux.world/flash, and you can upload your audio or your video there. And again, we'll play it throughout the week on the podcast, and we'll discuss this. We'll discuss whether or not we think, or you think, that brands are having a hard time on Amazon Alexa and Google Home. And to enable the VUX World Flash Briefing, just ask Alexa to enable VUX World Flash Briefing. Or you can visit vux.world/flash, and you can find the link there. Now, without further ado, let's get back to Simony Wilson. Let's kind of move on then. We've kind of covered a lot about your background and your career and the kind of different roles you've had, and from VUI design to tuning to now working more kind of on the customer side. And then we've covered Pindrop and what it is, what it does, looking at the passport and the security side, the authentication side, and what environments that can be deployed in currently and where you're looking to take it in the future. So let's move it on now to talk a little bit about the whole kind of VUI design thing, and specifically talking. Let's start with the kind of early IVR days and thinking about how when you were working at Microsoft or some of the roles that you had after that. When it comes to sort of designing for IVRs, how have things differed from or what was it like then, and then what is it like now, and how have things differed kind of throughout your career from an IVR perspective?
I'm glad you asked that, because I hadn't really thought of it from that perspective exactly. But what came to mind as you were forming that question was that I feel so free now in my design. I feel, it used to be very restrictive and prescriptive. We were limited always, and you continue to be limited by what your customer, wants to do or is willing to do or is willing to pay for. There are so many years that I was designing IVRs or tuning and saying, this is where it's falling down. I would recommend you make these changes, and I know that it will help your callers. And then, they would say, no, we don't want to do that for whatever reason, whether it was financial or they thought they knew better. And so they would stay with the DTMF only, or press or say prompts, or having really long sort of warnings at the beginning about your call being monitored, and all sorts of things that we knew as best practices were bad for callers. And you can do only so much arguing and pick your battles, and that you're going to market, or that customer's market with something that isn't going to be as friendly or usable as it should be. And like I said, now, because of this sort of, like you said, Renaissance speech, they recognize that their customers are demanding a much more natural interface. And though it used to be too expensive, and so they refused to do it, Now they realize they have to. And then in addition, I'm working in that sweet spot where it layers the voice on top of security, and that's another sweet spot. They also know that customers are starting to demand because of all of these, leaks of security and all of that private information going out. So I feel a lot freer now when or collaborating on a design, whether it's using our tools or anybody else's. There are so many permutations of ways you can improve a caller's experience, and it's exciting to me to be able to promote that and see the customers really taking that input and saying, yes, I recognize the value in that. Let's do that. It's just not something I've been used to. So it's a lot more fun. I have a lot less limitations that way.
Cool. And presumably the technology must have come a long way as well.
It has, in a lot of ways, but the capabilities and the neural networks, they were ready a long time ago, but they were expensive. And so really expensive, but they're more ubiquitous and they're being used more. And so they're quickly becoming cheaper. So in the past, it was more of it wasn't being implemented. And since it wasn't being implemented, it also couldn't be iterated on and improved. And designers like myself weren't able to really fully explore what we could do from a design perspective because there weren't many opportunities to do it. But now, it's like, hey, there's a while. It could do this before. But I'm glad everybody's coming along with it now.
And just to clarify, you not just in that piece there, but beforehand, you mentioned that clients used to be quite happy to do DTMF only. Was it? What's DTMF only mean?
So that's when you push the buttons on your phone instead of speaking.
Okay.
And so that's why I say the press or say, if you call and it says checking, press or say 1. And then a lot of times it was just press 1, and those are a lot of times a lot more annoying and longer and a waste of time and not fun to use.
Yeah, that's probably what contributed to giving the IVRs the not necessarily glorious name that they ended up having, with the press 1 for this, press 2 for that, press 3 for the other, and working through that. So do you think that because we mentioned when we kind of spoke about the sort of renaissance in the IVR kind of space, and I'm just thinking whether the more people get comfortable with speaking at stuff, whether or not that kind of reputation of IVR systems will steadily improve as people get more accustomed to speaking at stuff, providing the experience they get at the other end is the same. Do you think that the reason why it got a bad rap is because the experiences people were having were so poor, or because people just aren't used to being able to just speak at things?
Yeah, it was obviously a little bit of both, but it's. I heard a talk at Speech Tech a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things they said that stuck with me was that it used to be systems were built in such a restrictive way, such a very specific call flow. You had to say very specific things or press specific numbers. If you went outside that, it just wouldn't work for you. So in a way, the people calling in or talking to the systems had to adjust. And it's very interesting that it's turning the other way. The systems are so open-ended that now it's more based on what callers are saying. That data is being collected and used in machine learning to create intents. And so it's not so much that the callers or the users have to adapt to the system anymore, so makes it more fun and easier to use. But as long as we're capturing that data and designing the systems to respond appropriately, then they don't even notice that difference. They just know they're having a better experience.
So it sounds as though what's sitting behind some of the more advanced and sophisticated IVR sort of systems is fairly similar technology to what sits behind the kind of smart speakers in terms of the natural language processing and recognizing the intents and stuff like that. Is it roughly the same sort of technology behind the scenes?
It is, as far as voice goes, very similar technology. It's really just different tools or different code that you're using. And so for me, for years, after you've built IVRs or any kind of product in a different environment, you're used to whatever the tools are. You know what the pieces are. A tool is a tool, and it's really about the design and having access to all of that. So the underlying technology is the same. They're just implemented.
Cool. So we can let's kind of take a step back, and we'll kind of do two things. One, we'll go back to the time when you were designing VUI designs from the beginning, and then we can kind of advance that into the sort of like tuning area, because I think that's an area that's as I said at the beginning, really sort of overlooked in many spaces. A lot of people tend to spend all of the time doing a whole lot of upfront design and only having the budget to do the upfront design, and then as soon as they make something live, it's then, okay, that's live, that's that project done, let's move on. Whereas in actual fact, once it's live, that's when you actually start realizing whether or not it's any good, isn't it? So yeah, let's kind of go starting at the beginning then. So when you're kind of looking at, and it'd be interesting for people listening to this who are, lots of people listening to this will be focusing purely on smart speakers, for example, or purely on digital assistants or voice first kind of interactions, whether that's on the business end or the consumer end. And I'm just interested to see whether or not, if we can go through the kind of process for creating an IVR-based journey, to see whether or not there's anything in there, and I'm sure there will be, that can be applicable across kind of all kind of forms of VUI design. So could you talk us through, when you were in that kind of space, doing that sort of role, what your approach was to designing some of these IVR experiences?
Right. So initially, to design an IVR, you basically have to get all the business requirements right. So, well, what is it you're trying to achieve? What are your top 5 tasks? What is it you want to be able to do in the IVR? And then you got to look at the data that's available and how you're going to integrate with the data. So sort of designing that call flow level at a technical level, the design as far as prompts and the flow from a caller perspective, from a usability perspective, would be a layer that came after those initial discussions. And a lot that goes into at that point, once the bare bones technical stuff is established, it becomes, well, so what type of task is this? If it's a menuing task, or if it's a list task, if it's an information output task, depending on what it is that each task is trying to accomplish and the goals for it, how you're going to design a prompt. Each of those you would approach very differently. And there's all those best practices that are involved as far as how long menus should be and how many phrases callers, how long the phrases are that the callers should be saying, what are the fundamental pieces that should always be available, like main menu and cancel and things like that. Area is a very important thing to discuss with the customers as well. So, we might say checking, but if they have a specific terminology at a particular bank about what they call their checking account, we want to make sure that we've got those accounted for. And then you start looking into the grammar side of things. So you want callers in the past, right, to say specific items, but you don't want to restrict them to just those 5 words. So you build out the grammar so that one word translates to 20 different words or 20 different phrases, so that you're catching as many similar phrases as possible. So in the old days, it was very speech recognition, automatic speech recognition, ASR based. And thankfully now we're moving into more of that natural language so that the intents are being gathered. And that has to do with all those corpus of what people have been saying, whether it's to that customer or to other customers you've had, so that you can group a whole bunch of things together and get the intent rather than matching specific words. So, and when I'm designing, you take all those, you do the happy path, right? So you just take all of that information and you say, okay, if they wanted to call in and get information off of their checking account, here's the beginning, middle, and end of that. And you design those pieces, the grammar, the specific prompts and figure out that vocabulary and how the data is going to be fed back and forth with your customer. But really, the majority of your time ends up being spent on what if they don't go down the happy path. It's sort of that 80-20 rule. 80% of your callers are going to get this right the first time if we've designed this correctly. But what's going to happen to the 20% who don't know what to say or say it at the wrong time or just don't understand the question or want to do something else? How are we going to handle that? And that's everything helpful, or when to offer them to go to an agent, or when to automatically go to an agent. All of that type of information is really where a lot of the debate ends up being, is handling all of those things gracefully. So you can only do so much of this design up to this point, based on best practices, based on previous customers in a similar environment, et cetera. As well as talking to your customer about what they think they know about their callers. I like to do Wizard of Oz studies along the way, which really in the case of what I used to do was just mock out those happy paths more or less, and then sort of sit across the table from a colleague or a family member and walk through the system would say and have them respond and sort of see what surprises are in store for you from somebody who doesn't know the system from a design perspective, because there are always surprises. Hammer out some of those things at an early sort of pencil and paper stage before you start doing something expensive, and then you have code. And then if you're lucky, there's an actual usability group at your company where they can invest in bringing in a few people to test this with you before you launch. But that's all before you ever launch it the first time.
And then presumably once you do launch it the first time, that's when the fun starts.
For me, that's exactly, I always say, please break it. Like that's so much more fun for me, because columns always do something unexpected. And, I think some designers really like the aspect of being able to say, see, I got it right the first time, but that's just not real. I've seen that happen. In fact, you just can't get it right 100% the first time. So once you get that out to actual callers, there's a full analysis that can happen. And again, it just depends on what tools you have available, but it's both qualitative and quantitative. And so really, you do hear that up front, this call may be monitored or recorded. And the recording, usually in the case that I've worked with, is when you can transcribe. We're going to listen to your call and hear your pain and hear your struggle and hear your frustration. Be able to apply that. Listen to 5,000 phone calls, which was fairly typical to analyze a system, and transcribe all of these different points, question and answers throughout an IVR, whether it was focused on a certain area or end to end. Run analysis tools. I've done in-house tools. I've done leading industry tools. Again, it just doesn't matter. A tool is a tool, but basically then you can get statistics on how many callers are failing at a state. If they're failing, is it usually speech recognition that's the problem? Do they, where are they pressing 0, which usually means they don't know what they're doing. All of those statistics can be brought up. And so you can get kind of an idea right off the top and say, well, this state, 95% of callers are saying the right things and being successful. And so we don't need to worry about that state. But at another state, another question answer point, maybe event recognition. So you want to go in there and look at those numbers, what they're pointing to. And some of the first things that you can figure out is vocabulary based, right? So things you just did not anticipate callers saying that are actually legitimate answers at a particular question. It may not be a legitimate answer, or it may point to something else that it should be doing that it's not. So sometimes that just means you need to change the way the question is worded, but other times it means you need to add vocabulary or a whole new tab. And so those things are all fairly basic, low-hanging fruit. The first pass through, you can find those things fairly easily. They're repetitive. They happen everywhere, that type of problem. But there's usually one or two, just interesting, different things that are unexpected, and you have to change maybe low. Callers are all trying to do this way up here. And then you go back to, whoever the company was that launched this with you, and you say, why are customers saying this here? I've never heard that word. Is there like a word internal that, is it on their credit card? Is it on their statement? Is there something that we're not aware of? And it ends up being something. So I said, well, maybe they're using an old account number from before we merged with this other bank, and they just, didn't realize they had the numbers of people calling using a different account number. So that's more fun for me to sort of figure out the mysteries of it. And I do find it fun. And listening to the transcription, listening while I transcribe is very fun. If you're using it correctly, that's boring. But if you're, if you're screaming at your dog or if you're screaming at the system, that's a lot more entertaining for me.
It's almost like, I think there's a ton of similarities in there from what you've said in terms of, the IVR space specifically, but then translate that through. Even an Alexa skill, for example, or a Google Home action, or an audio game, or anything along those lines that seem to be gaining quite a lot of traction amongst the kind of like voice first developer communities. That's all the kind of stuff that you'd be looking at doing to try and understand whether your kind of voice first application is doing the right thing as well, isn't it? Like looking at your failure rate, and unfortunately there isn't a pressing 0 option, which must give you a lot of insight where people are pressing 0. But yeah, it just seems that there's quite a lot of similarities in there, in terms of the sort of like the VUI tuning side. Because as I said before, the kind of typical thing, certainly from most companies from the likes of a website perspective or something like that. I think if you design it and build it in-house, it's probably a little bit different. But most companies that would kind of, let's say, bring an agency in, for example, and create a website or an app or whatever, it's very much just kind of like launch it and move on kind of approach, isn't it? So how was the VUI tuning part and parcel of the projects that you were working on, or was it always something that you had to then go and sell on afterwards?
Yeah, that you're exactly right. So it did follow very much sort of a website building model, whereas you might build the website and launch it and never revisit it. Well, that's a mistake already. It should be dynamic. You should be revisiting it. But various customers over the years just have that sort of, I already spent the money, it's functioning fine, let's move on to something else. And so we get that same approach with VUI design, and launch a system and never, as long as it wasn't breaking, right? As long as they weren't getting obvious complaints that the agents or the data just wasn't coming through, then they would often just leave it. And that's why, one of the main contributors to why people hate IVR is because there just wasn't responsible maintenance and update. So for me, over the years, it's been, I've had the opportunity to evangelize about tuning. It wasn't always integrated into the sales cycle when I started doing it. But the more I would say we need to be doing this, and I'd get one opportunity to do it there, they would automatically see the value, whether it was the company I was working for or the company that was receiving the tuning. You always see the value. And so over the years, it became something that got rolled into the sales process. So you'd sell it and you'd say, we also have this great tuning thing, because best practices has become, you do not launch this and walk away. You launch it, and you do a quick maybe analysis 30 to 60 days later, and then you might leave it for 6 months or a year, or you wait until you need to add a new feature, but then you evaluate it again. And that is how you keep your callers coming back and happy, not only with your IVR. And so it did become, at my most recent company where I was doing that exclusively, tuning, to really structure that and evangelize for it. And by the time I left, it was part of the initial sales process, where there's one initial tuning 30 to 60 days out that is included in the price. And then you can buy sort of these sign-on, whether it's a one-time six months later, or whether it's a regular maintenance thing. And it became a regular part that everybody was buying. So that made me happy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that seems like a fundamental thing, really, when you think about it. Do you know what I mean? Like, the chances of, unless you're doing a shed load of really intense research and testing throughout your kind of development, which, you know, some places do. Some places will do a bit of design, bit of testing, or a lot of design, bit of testing, launch. So I think that, you know, and even people out there who are creating these sort of voice first applications and stuff like that, or whether you're in the kind of IVR space, I think you can't really stress enough how important it is to keep on top of that once it's gone live, because that's when you actually see whether or not all your hard work's paying off, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah, I completely agree. But it's amazing when people are looking at their budget, what goes first.
Yeah, that's class. Wicked. Have you got any? Let's say that you know, there's a lot of VUI designers listening to this, a lot of sort of developers and people who are looking at crafting voice first experiences. Have you got any tips for people who are doing this, or people who might just be getting into this kind of space? Who's got their ears pricked by Alexa or what have you? Have you got any tips for people getting into the sort of VUI design space or the VUI tuning space?
Yeah, well, I would just say, I mean, it's a really exciting time. Things like there are a lot of tools online that you can use. Like you can dive right in, whether it's designing for home devices or doing sort of more phone call related IVRs that you can really dive in and do yourself. And right now is the time to get on board, because for years there's just been kind of a small community of, and you kind of knew everybody. That just wasn't expanding. And so I'm excited for all the young people who are coming in and excited to do this, because it's so easy to do, you know, just right on your laptop. So I know that I'm excited to see people like myself who've been in IVR moving into this more IoT area and bringing those skills into this new speech horizon versus like the new people who are starting now who have only designed for that area. And so I'm looking at the cross section of where those skills come together. And I think that that's where the most potential is. And so I would say it's really tempting probably to just focus on the new intent-driven, simple skill level of the new devices. But if you have an understanding of the old IVRs, like you said, almost everybody has one at this point, and they need to be brought forward and improved and brought into this new horizon of speech. And so there's a lot of potential there just from, you know, making yourself marketable. If it's something you love to do, then you're going to love taking those old, busted, hated systems and bringing them into the new technology. And that's something I'm looking forward to.
Wicked. Fantastic, and it sounds as though Pindrop are on track to be doing just that. Certainly introducing some well-needed technology, and I'm you know, really looking forward to seeing how all that kind of pans out. So where can people find out more about Pindrop and find out a little bit more about yourself, Simone?
Well, yeah. So Pindrop, it's pindropsecurity.com or pindrop.com. Like you said, we've got a lot of good videos. They're short videos online. Our Facebook and LinkedIn try to be really active as well to post those things. But like I said, we launched our new product in January, and we have really good examples. They're easy to consume and they're fun. Like you said, the Bitcoin example. So you could spend a very short amount of time on our website and really get a lot of that information. And it helps from an end user perspective, see exactly what's going on. There's also, of course, an attempt on the website to explain to the degree that we're not going to explain it all to you, but it's consumable as well, because it gets pretty technical. Our research group, I don't even know everything they do. So I would definitely reach out there. And for myself, I S. Wilson at pindrop.com. I'm always happy to network with people, especially, like I said, the young people coming into the area. There, you know, we'll be hiring at Pindrop, but I know there's a lot of opportunities. So I'm often advice and help in that way. Just, you know, because I'm excited about the whole field. I want all of us to, you know, come up together. Excited to see what's next.
Wicked. Thank you very much. We'll put all of those links in the show notes. And if anyone out there is looking at, you know, getting involved in this space and wants to work at the cutting edge of authentication security, then drop Simone a line. Cool, wicked. Thank you very much, Simony. Really, really appreciate you joining us. I think we've covered probably more than I thought we would there, actually. The whole Pindrop thing, your career and experience, VUI design, VUI tuning. I think we got real deep insights into all that there. So thank you so much for joining us. Really, really appreciate that.
Thank you.
That was Simony Wilson from Pindrop. Fantastic episode that. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did, because that was, I think that what I was hoping for from that was some of the similarities between IVR and other voice first devices and applications, and I think we covered that broadly speaking. There was lots of stuff in there around security, so the passport thing from Pindrop sounds as though it would fit hand in hand with any voice assistant regardless of device and format. Being able to prove that you are who you say you are via your voice assistant, I think, is a massively critical part that will really push this industry forward. So I do really hope that Pindrop are really pushing themselves into the Google Home and Amazon Alexa and Siri and Cortana space, because I think that would unlock quite a few doors. Lots of stuff there from Simony around VUI design, and there's lots of similarities again there in terms of looking at what your kind of top business needs are. That's arguably what you would do as a business if you were trying to create something like an Alexa skill or what have you. Or a customer service based virtual assistant. You'd be looking at trying to solve your main customer pain points, mapping out your user journey and that happy path. I've heard that spoke about quite a lot in this kind of space, and the ideal user journey, and then how you deal with people who don't quite follow that happy path, how you deal with those errors, the error recovery side of things as well. And then the tuning, the bit that people seemingly forget about, and I'm glad that Alexa does kind of push and reward people for keeping up the engagement and the constant iteration of skills, because that's where the magic happens, really. That's where you really learn what's what and what's working and what isn't, and how you can change things for the better. So it was really interesting to hear Simony's approach, and there's lots of similarities in there as well. So thank you, Simony, for joining us. That was an immensely interesting episode. Thank you everybody for listening. I do hope my cold hasn't been too irritating. I'll try and in the edit I'll try and kind of make it a little bit more better. But I do feel a bit like Phoebe. I don't know if you've seen that episode where she got a cold, she went and done some singing, and the voice was really croaky. Everybody loved it. She got a load of singing gigs, and then a cold went and everyone lost interest. So I don't know if that's going to happen here, where you're going to be really interested and gripped to your speakers with this croaky sounding voice, and then as soon as our voice goes back to normal, I'll probably see the listenership drop. But anyway, never mind. Thank you very much, Simony, and thank you all for listening, and until next time, see you later.